Hello and welcome to Section 5 of Chapter 39 of the American Pageant. We're covering the stalemated 70s. We're looking at the Bicentennial campaign to the foreign affairs and the Iranian Imbroglio. I'm sure what that means. So let's get into it. The election of 1976. You have President Gerald Ford, who was appointed, not elected, running for the Republicans. And at that point, this is a low point in American history in terms of confidence in the government. The Democrats correctly guess and nominate a Washington outsider, somebody who has no connection to Vietnam, no connection to Watergate, to any of these scandals. They nominate the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, and his running mate is Walter Mondale. So Carter's a Washington outsider. He has no connection with those scandals. Ford barely wins the Republican nomination. There was a tough campaign from the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, this up-and-coming politician was gaining in popularity, and so Ford barely eked out the victory for his own party's nomination. Remember, he wasn't elected to an executive position. He tried to stress his achievements. Not sure what they were. He pardoned Nixon, they granted amnesty to Vietnam vets. He fell down a couple times. He signed the Helsinki Accords and the SALT agreements. His solution to fix the inflation was whip inflation now. Whip it good. Carter won a pretty close election, actually. Here's this is a sad day for Old Glory. It's some of the anti-busing protests in Boston in 1976. 76 was not good. About the only highlight of the year was the big fireworks for the Bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the United States' birthday. Here's the electoral map, and it looks like most of the East went to Carter, most of the West went to Ford. You do have Ronald Reagan winning a couple of votes in Washington, and stealing some votes from Gerald Ford. It's a very close election. It's within 1 million votes. So Jimmy Carter, he's a peanut farmer from Georgia. He's a really nice guy. I mean, a really, really good person. He builds homes to this day. He's in his 90s for Habitat for Humanity. He is a super nice guy. Not sure he's the best president. He was down to earth. He was nice. He walked to his inauguration instead of riding in the limo. He didn't always wear suits. He liked to wear sweaters and jeans. And so this is kind of who he was. He would never lie to the public, but he doesn't come across as a very strong leader. Because of his brother, Billy Carter, who was making beer, Billy beer as it was called, and they found out it was illegal for individuals to make beer. And so because his brother was trying to gain fame based on his brother being the president and sell beer, him and Congress, President Carter, passed laws allowing people to make home-brewed beer again, which leads to the birth of the home-brewing craft beer industry in the late 70s and the 80s, and then it booms in the 90s and to this day. He never really understood how Washington politics worked. He struggled with it. He was kind of wishy-washy. He did create the Department of Energy. He increased spending and cut taxes to try to stimulate the economy. That stagflation throughout the decade, that high inflation and low or high unemployment, which is called stagflation, continues. Unemployment drops, inflation soars. And so he does the opposite. He cuts spending and raises taxes, and it just looks like he doesn't really know what he's doing. It made him seem weak. It made him seem uncertain. He later pardoned thousands of draft dodgers, all the remaining ones. And so the public didn't have a lot of confidence in him. His foreign policy was entirely based on human rights. He basically thought that if you did good things to people, we'll help you. If you do bad things, if you take away basic human rights, we will not support your regime. He withdrew aid from countries who violated human rights. He helped boycott South Africa and their apartheid policies, which is their segregation in the late 70s. He allowed Cuban refugees to come to America in 1980. Basically, Cuban refugees would not be turned around or turned away, and so they were allowed to be housed and put in the United States. And so Castro unloaded his jails, so got rid of a bunch of criminals, a bunch of political dissidents who came to America because he knew Jimmy Carter would take them. That's actually the basis of the movie Scarface with Al Pacino, by the way. Criminals and political prisoners. And then the Panama Canal, he signed treaties with Panama to give the canal back in 2000. He thought it was bad. The United States had bullied its way in, took the canal zone, like Theodore Roosevelt said, and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes, so does the canal. And so he signed an agreement to give it back. and as long as they kept it a neutral waterway. And in 2000, the U.S. gave the Panama Canal back to Panama, which some people to this day think is crazy. He was trying to build better relations with Latin America. In the Middle East, he did help with peace talks between Israel and Egypt. He brought their leaders to the United States to Camp David to work out an agreement between Israel and Egypt. He got Menachem Begin, who's the president of Israel, and Anwar al-Sadat, the president of Egypt. Maybe I get the titles backwards, I'm sorry, to negotiate, and they signed this monumental Camp David Accords. It was the first time, this is 30 years after Israel was founded, the first time in history that any Arab nation had signed any treaty with Israel. It was a monumental thing. In fact, President Carter wins the Nobel Peace Prize for it later in life. Sadly, unfortunately, Anwar al-Sadat was murdered, assassinated in his own country for doing this. And so he won the Nobel Prize. This is probably his crowning achievement of his entire presidency, was the Camp David Accords. It didn't mean lasting peace in the Middle East, though, sadly. Here's a picture of it. This was signed in September 1978. The inflation was rising steadily. By 1979, inflation prices had rose to 13%. Americans learned that they were no longer economically isolated in the world. There was, competition from Europe and Japan. Carter called for legislation to improve energy conservation. He did create the Department of Energy. That oil embargo had lasting ripple effects for the rest of the decade in the U.S., and so finding new cheap sources of fuel was important, and the U.S. had to improve its energy conservation. He didn't have a lot of public support for this. The high cost of energy fueled the inflation. The dependence on foreign oil created a trade deficit not in the U.S.'s favor. And so in April 77, Carter presents his National Energy Plan, which tried to reduce energy use. It created the Department of Energy. It explored alternative fuel sources, including oil shale in western Colorado. Nuclear was touted as maybe this could be the cure for it. We don't need to depend on nuclear or on Arab oil if we have nuclear energy. Then in March 1979, you have the meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, the worst nuclear meltdown in the history of the United States. Not as bad as Chernobyl, but pretty darn bad. Because of this, people protested the use of nuclear energy. Construction of nuclear power plants were put on hold. There are still proponents to this day that think nuclear energy is the future. It's cleaner, it's safer. And people point back to 3 Mile Island. They point to Chernobyl and say, nah, we're good. Carter stood firm. He didn't shut down the nuclear power plants that were already in operation. 10% of the nation's energy came from it. In 1979, Iran's Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was overthrown. This is the guy the United States put in power, the CIA put in power back in the 50s. He was overthrown and succeeded by the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who does not like the United States at all. He is an Iranian fundamentalist Muslim. They were very opposed to Western customs, and arch enemy number one was the United States. Because of this, Iran stops exporting oil to the U.S., OPEC raises the oil prices. They cause another oil crisis, which, kind of pushes Carter's energy plan, further into, urgency. In 1979, in July, Carter retreated to Camp David and met with hundreds of advisors on what to come up with the solution to Americans' problems. And so on July 15, 1979, he gave his malaise speech in which he chastised America for having an obsession with material goods and stunning the nation. He basically said that Americans all have a crisis in confidence. Americans want things, and they want to own things. And it's a really good sermon for Sunday afternoon at church. It's really powerful, but it doesn't fix the economy. It doesn't fix the oil crisis, and it really stuns the nation that he would do this. A few days later, he fired 4 cabinet secretaries, I guess, for letting him do it. You guys can check it out on YouTube. This is, what is this? The History of Consumer Price Index. You can see that the rise of the 70s is super steep. I hit the button on accident, sorry. And it still kind of levels out, and then it just keeps going and going and going. In the Soviet Union, Carter does sign SALT II, an agreement with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, and so the strategic arms limit talks, too, were signed. The Senate refused to ratify it, though. Negotiations to ratify this treaty fell apart when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, which becomes their Vietnam, their unwinnable war that kind of drains their economy and hurts everything. And actually, it leads to the downfall of the Soviet Union. Carter ordered sanctions. In fact, he approved the boycott of the 1980 Olympics because they were in Moscow, which is still to this day one of the most baffling things to mix politics and sports, to rob 450 Olympians of their lifelong goal of training to go to the Olympics because of politics. You know, people to this day are pretty upset by the boycott of the 1980 Olympics. In turn, the Soviets boycotted the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, and the U.S. won every gold medal they could. And so that's what's going on with that. So the crisis in Iran. Iran used to be the U.S.'s strongest ally in the Persian Gulf besides Israel. When the fundamentalists take over and they kick the Shah out of power, in fact, he comes to the United States for cancer treatment at that point. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in Paris at the time, came back. In November 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy and took 52 American hostages. The U.S. tried to negotiate their release. Iran wouldn't budge. They tried to do a daring helicopter rescue for them. There was a sandstorm that led to the crash of the helicopters and killed 8 military personnel. And this it grows, and Carter does everything in his power. He's a super nice guy to try to release these hostages. It becomes an issue in the 1980 campaign. Carter ultimately loses the election of 1980 to Ronald Reagan. I go into that much more in chapter 40. And then sadly, to rub it in Carter's face, hours after Reagan is inaugurated, the hostages were released after 444 days of captivity without any concessions by the United States. They just wanted to make Carter look bad. So here's the protest. The Iranians denounce Carter. These are the hostages here on the right. Kind of an ugly situation there from what used to be one of the most powerful allies, the United States. And to this day, Iran is kind of I wouldn't say nemesis or an enemy, but maybe a troublesome person or country to the U.S. This is a Carter video. You can check it out. That's all I have. And this closes. This is my last history video that I'm making. This has been a 3-year journey. This is my 118th history video. I hope you've enjoyed them. I'll probably make some psychology ones more down the road. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, reach out to me. And once again, just thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something from history.